Grasshopper Radio.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second Gresham's Question Time event. We ran this event 2 years ago, and we run it in this particular week because it is UK Parliament week, and this is one of a number of events that Gresham's is holding this week to mark that celebration of the importance of the UK Parliament. And just before we start debating the issues this evening, it's a timely reminder. The current Parliament has a very bad reputation. It's been blamed for the failure to deliver Brexit, but we should never forget that the UK Parliament is one of the most robust, one of the best regulated, and one of the most effective and historic parliaments in the world, and that's why it's so worth celebrating. So the way this evening is going to work, fortunately, Boris Johnson and Parliament did us a favour by causing a general election. So we're going to do two things this evening. As well as having a debate about politics, I'm also going to introduce you to some of the candidates who are going to be contesting the Gresham's mock election. We've had mock elections at Gresham's, in my time at least, since 2005. In 2005 it was won by the Conservatives. In 2010 it was won by Labour. In 2015 it reverted to the Conservatives, and in 2017 for the first time Gresham's went to the Greens. So let me introduce you to the panellists and also some of your mock election candidates. Two of them this evening can't be here at the moment because they're engaged in a play rehearsal. If they don't make it at all, you'll get a chance to hear what they've got to say in chapel later in the term. So, to my right, we have Georgie Clark, standing for the Women's Equality Party. The Women's Equality Party is a new party and contested the Gresham's election for the first time back in 2017. Next, we have not a candidate, but a member of staff, Mr. Shortman, who works in the Economics and Business Department at the school. And then further to the right there, only in the sense of geography, not in terms of politics, you understand, we have Joe Nash, standing for the Conservative Party, a party that he's also represented in an election at the prep school. Moving left down the line, we have Tom Sankey, representing the Green Party. Then we have something of an election veteran at Gresham's, Luke Nash, who this year is representing the Socialist Labour Party, and that's the first time that party has stood for election in a Gresham's election, again in my time here at least. And then, last but not least, we have Mr. Richardson of the Maths Department, who makes up our panel this evening. There are two further candidates. For Labour, we have Andrew Kinder, and for the Liberal Democrats, we have Joe Oxtoby, and hopefully they might get a chance to join us if their rehearsal finishes and allows them to do so. So let me quickly go through the procedure for this evening. It really depends on you. What I need from you is lots of questions for our panellists. The question that you ask will be answered by each of our 6 panellists, and I'll ask a different person to kick off each time. Because we've got such a large number of panellists, we'll try to limit responses to something along the lines of a maximum of 2 minutes. If you speak in less than 2 minutes, that will be absolutely fine. So without further ado, let's kick the event off and get proceedings underway. Do we have a question, a first question from the audience tonight to launch to our panellists, please? We had exactly the same reluctance at the start of the last event, and then we had questions in there. Thank you very much, Mac. Could you state your question, please?
I would just like to know what the candidates believe they would do if they were to be elected in foreign policy-wise. How would you re-establish Britain's respect that it has lost over the past decade?
Thank you very much. Yeah, an unusual first question and a really interesting one. So the question is, if you were elected, how you or your party would seek to revive Britain's reputation in the world. If we could start, please, with that one with Joe Nash.
Okay, so I feel like we need to get Brexit done before we can actually move on with any relations, and I feel like trade deals with other nations in Europe can work once we finish Brexit. And also America, we can form a bond with America when we've finished with the whole Brexit malarkey as such, when we get it done, and then after that we can work on relations and ties between each nation that you talk about. So yeah, it's all based on Brexit and finishing that, and then we can work from there.
Thank you very much, Joe. Mr. Richardson, what would your view be of that particular question?
It's a long road. I think it's been a bit of a mockery the last number of years for everyone, for the Parliament and for many of the politicians involved. My main concern with my own background in Northern Ireland would be that the first area that will need to be addressed will be the Northern Ireland problem. I think Brexit will happen probably quite soon, but at what cost? Okay, it's been nearly 50 years of trouble in Northern Ireland to get a peace deal, and there's a danger that something will be rushed through which could lead to a reigniting of issues there. So I think we're going to be very careful, and going to be very careful on their own doorstep here, as well as these EU and US and further afield relationships.
Thank you very much. Tom Sankey, how do you see that from a Green perspective?
Well, as the Green Party, I would argue that Brexit is a major issue for environmental development. I mean, not only would it be economically a disadvantage to leave the EU, I would say it's a fantastic in preventing carbon emissions as a system. Like, they put in the European Union emissions trading schemes, which was the first ever scheme to financially incentivize people to reduce their own carbon emissions and punish those who don't. The UK itself doesn't have anything like this, so I think staying within the EU would be very important for the environment as a whole.
Thank you, Tom. And next, Luke, how do you see this question?
I take quite a similar line to the Conservatives, or certainly that my organisation does, certainly in terms of we're going to get us out of the European Union first. That's a very important thing that we have to do in order to properly regulate what we would like to do as a nation in terms of foreign policy. And once we're out, we have a greater extent of governance over who we can strike a deal with. And though I wouldn't probably go along the same lines as the Conservatives, owing to sort of our role as a custodian in the global context, we had an empire and we left our colonies to ruin by pulling out militarily, causing wars in, I think, 8 out of the 10 African nations that we colonised. And so we would look to re-establish and rebuild in our former colonies, maintaining a fairly imperialistic view, I know, but this wouldn't just be confined to the Commonwealth. We'd also look to profess relationships in the Third World, so particularly the Caribbean, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, possibly former French-Belgian regions, and also parts of Southeast Asia as well, purely on the basis that we seek to have a more global outlook, which will enable us to have a greater or a more broad extent of governance and being able to control who Britain will be in the future, and that's fundamentally why we have to get out of the European Union first.
Thank you. Georgie, what do you think?
Well, the Women's Equality Party has a slightly different stance on Brexit, where it's more that if Brexit should happen, there are certain aims that must be achieved. But if the question is assuming that my party would have a majority, then it would probably hold a second referendum to be absolutely sure what the country wants regarding Brexit. If they voted to leave, then we would ensure that rights for not just women but for all other vulnerable groups were preserved, especially with equality laws. And then for improving international relations, improving equality in all areas and kind of being a sort of global trendsetter for improving the rights of every citizen.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Shortman, as an economist, I mean, you must have an interesting slant on that particular
Yeah,
question.
the question was what would you do with foreign policy? So for me, three main facets. On the China-Hong Kong issue, I think from a foreign political point of view, I think Britain's been too quiet on that, considering that Hong Kong used to be part of British territory, so promoting British values, I suppose. Investing in the military, both from a security point of view and also the macroeconomic benefits, creating employment through that. And focusing more on the soft power that Britain offers. I think a lot of, for the film industry, for example, a lot of British culture permeates across country. And I think in this debate about Brexit, some of the focus away from other British assets such as soft power and culture have sort of been watered down. So I think in some respects all the focus on EU and UK policy has taken Britain's eye off in a foreign policy perspective on other issues elsewhere.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panellists for such brief and to the point answers. If I can just go back to the audience very briefly, not for a further question at this point. The question that Mag asked implied that there has been a weakening of Britain's role in the world. Is that something that you in the audience feel yourselves? Do you feel that Britain is less respected, is somehow less credible than it was 10 years ago? If any of you, several of you are nodding, if somebody would just like to give me why you think that, those who do think that. Thank you. Bella.
I think, I mean, this isn't my view necessarily, but I think a lot of people believe that the foreign opinion is now that our politics is kind of a mess, and it's quite shameful in the same way as America is looked at in the media. I think, you know, people, my mum was talking to me about it, and she was saying that she avoids saying that she's from Britain because people go, oh, Britain, that's awful what's going on in your politics at the moment. And I think if it's not an actual like degeneration of foreign policy, I think for international relations are kind of quite looking down on us at the moment in that sense, because our politics is such a mess and Brexit is taking so long to get through that it's sort of like, it speaks to how weak politics is at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other opinions from the floor before we come to our second question? Does anyone fundamentally disagree that Britain is somehow weaker in the eyes of the rest of the world? Okay, no. Do we have a second question then from the floor? A second issue to explore, please. Thank you.
A lot of people say that there are many disadvantages of the Brexit. So how would your party deal with them or avoid them?
Okay, so there are some allegations that there are going to be downsides to Brexit. Very good question. If there are going to be some downsides to Brexit, which we presume there would be even if you're in favour of Brexit, how is your party going to deal with those downsides if Brexit happens? Thank you very much. Okay, so this time, please, if we could start with George.
Okay, well, I think so. A lot of the downsides would be, okay, as the previous question implied, like sort of international relations, and also lots of economic issues potentially due to like suddenly a completely different sort of trade deals. Like a lot, we won't be necessarily like trading with many countries in the EU anymore. But so I think it would first work to sort of improve the economy, which actually, I mean, like Britain's like economy is not doing amazingly well at the moment. So I think the best way of doing that is sort of actually equality. So things like the pay gap, and also having more women in professional occupations, kind of getting more people to kind of be contributing to the economy, and again being a global trendsetter for international relations.
Thank you very much. Second, Luke.
The disadvantages, firstly, they've been accentuated a little bit than is perhaps apparent. Yes, they do still exist, but the press has played a rather chauvinistic role in saying, no, Brexit's going to be horrendous, when actually it provides an opportunity for real change. And with that real change, the only way that will ever work is with a completely different outlook on how we regard ourselves, how we treat our economy, how we treat our people. And if we become a more collectivistic culture, that's to say we treat everyone for the good of the community rather than the individual, then I think a lot of the economic downturn that Brexit may or may not provide, that hasn't been entirely finalised yet, will be mitigated or eliminated entirely. So to give an example, the whole thing with private enterprise and anti-tax avoidance, though we would lose some EU regulation on the anti-tax avoidance, which Jacob Rees-Mogg and other Conservatives have so deftly avoided in their questions, we can make new rules for that under a socialist principle and a socialist government where we act for the good of the community, and we will be able to restore the funding deficit that has been created by capitalist inequality. And so when I say that there are disadvantages to Brexit, I would agree with you. However, I think we have not looked at the advantages, and in my opinion, and in the opinion I'm sure of a lot of pro-Brexit parties, the advantages will outweigh the disadvantages.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Shortman, again, as an economist, do you think that the premise of the question is correct? Do you think that the disadvantages of Brexit will outweigh any advantages to be gained?
Well, I think the main disadvantage so far, you could argue, is actually the failure to implement Brexit, whether you're in favour of Brexit or not, is actually the key cost at the moment. So the uncertainty of do we leave, or how do we leave, or do we not leave, is creating more economic instability than actually leaving or remaining, the failure to make a decision. And I suppose what that exposes is the clash between direct democracy through a referendum and representational democracy through parliamentary sovereignty, which has the greatest power. Is it Parliament who has so far blocked Brexit from occurring, you could argue, or is it the people, given that Parliament instructed the people to make a decision? From my point of view, the economic instability with having firms planning for 3 exit dates that are now passed is actually greater than any costs or benefits from either staying in the EU or leaving, kind of in this halfway house of purgatory. So from my point of view, I mean, I am someone who voted for Brexit from a sovereignty point of view. Having said that, I would respect if Parliament revoked Article 50, because then it would at least make a decision. Sort of the inertia and the failure to make a decision, I feel, has more impacts on the economy than actually leaving or remaining one way or another.
I think you should take up a career in politics. Okay. For that answer. Thank you very much. And then Joe, for the Conservatives.
I have to agree with my brother, the BSP, the Socialist Labour Party, on this point, as the press has greatly enlarged the problems of Brexit, saying it's going to be catastrophic, the economy's going to die. No, not necessarily. If we get Brexit done, the better our economy will be after it. The time we're wasting on this right now and is just creating greater problems that will happen in the future. And also, if the Conservatives have the most realistic spending ideas for when they get into power, or if they get into power, sorry, I should say. Whereas somebody like Labour would catastrophically increase the government debt, as they think money grows on trees. They'll increase spending because they try and increase over the Conservatives, and it will just catastrophically affect the economy more than if we get into power, essentially.
Thank you. And Tom, for the Greens, what do you think?
I would agree with Joe in how he's saying that Brexit has been a big time waster, essentially. You look at the other countries, you look at your France, your Netherlands, your Germany. They, in the last two and a bit years, they have been making great strides in environmental damage, fixing the environmental damage that we as a planet we the people have created. So do Brexit or don't Brexit, what's important is that we fix the climate emergency that's ever so rapidly approaching.
Thank you very much. Mr. Richardson, you've already suggested you've got some concerns about Brexit from a Northern Irish point of view. So if I could bring you back to the question, and what are your thoughts on that?
I think I would, to sort of really piggyback on what Mr. Shortman was saying, I think people just they just need to have a little faith. Like, there's a very dynamic, creative economy, especially in the southeast of England, and everybody's just waiting to react. Like, everyone's waiting and waiting and waiting, and there's a lot of great people, a lot of great minds, a lot of great businesses, and they just need to know what's going to happen. They can deal with problems, but not until they actually happen. So I just have faith. I have faith in the markets. I mean, the markets are just building in doom and gloom because we're doing nothing right now. Once we know what's actually happening, then there's people who can get us out of this problem. Yes, there'll be a bump in the road that's coming soon, hopefully, and then you react and you recover, and if you're good enough, your business will thrive, and if you can't figure it out, you'll go bust and somebody else will set up a business because you've got a dynamic economy. But as it is at the moment, we're just in limbo, and so we need something to happen one way or the other for these great minds to get busy at making some money for everyone.
Well, we've had 2 questions so far and some wonderful answers from all of the panellists, but everyone at the moment's been quite cordial. So I'm just going to throw a little fireworks now into proceedings. And what I would like from each of the panellists, before I ask the next question from the floor, is for you to tell me which political party you would most fear winning this general election. So of the options before the British electorate, which is the party that, were they to win it, would fill you with the most fear? Tom for the Greens, if you could give your answer first, please.
Honestly, I would argue the Conservative Party, clearly. So we've seen that since the Conservatives have been in power since the late noughties, the inequality in Britain has essentially gone through the roof. Between 2010 and 2019, more than £30 billion in spending reductions have been made for essentially welfare, housing, social services. Essentially, what they've been doing is making the most impoverished in society worse off. I mean, if you were to look at the Welfare Reform Act, in 2012 there were 3.5 children in poverty. Since then that number has rose by 600,000, and now there is 4.1 million children in poverty, which brings that the number to 37%. And I think that is pretty outrageous looking at it. Additionally, post-Brexit, they want to turn the country into, I think Boris Johnson has said many times, a tax haven, which once again is just another example of a rich get richer mentality and the poor don't. I mean, there's been examples, they'd say, oh, we'll make it like Singapore, we'll make it like Luxembourg. Ooh. But it may work there because the population is small and trickle-down economics could have some ground over there. But in the UK, the population is far too large to support trickle-down economics, which I don't think the Conservatives have either considered or they're purposely avoiding.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shortman, what do you think?
Which party do I fear most? Well, so far the other candidates sitting alongside me, I'm not too fearful of them so far. But in a general election context, I think the Brexit Party. And I'm someone of fairly conservative political views, I suppose. So I could talk about Jeremy Corbyn's renationalisation process, but actually Labour and Conservative, whether you like them or not, they're quite a broad church and they have quite a lot of check and balances within their parties. There's quite a broad range of views. So I can feel that there's some Labour people who have views sort of in line with me and Conservative as well. The party I'm really fearful of, I don't think they'll cut through, but the Brexit Party, that seems more of a business or a firm rather than a political party, and Nigel Farage seems more of a religious preacher rather than a politician. They are the real unknown quantity. If they were, and I think this is highly unlikely, but if they were to cut through, how would that work, given that they are united as an organisation on their Eurosceptic views, but they have no real organisation or structure to them, and it seems a vehicle for Nigel Farage's ego rather than truly believing in Brexit, and that's my point of view. That's the party I'd be most fearful of.
Thank you very much. We don't currently have a representative from the school standing for the Brexit Party, so following that advertisement, if you want to sign up, do let me know before Friday. Thank you very much.
Easier said than done.
So next, please, I'd like to go to Georgie and hear what you think from the Women's Equality Party point of view.
I think the Women's Equality Party, I think would be most afraid of, as Tom said, the Conservatives, partly due to, of course, the inequality, as has already been highlighted, and in particular, but also due to and I know a lot of this is a stereotype, but the fact that Conservative, and this applies to all parties, other than arguably the Women's Equality Party, but most political parties, there is not equal representation of women. So 51% of the population are female, but the record for MPs is 32%. And Conservatives, I think, have the largest percentage of male MPs. And, well, again, stereotype is the old white man being in politics. And I know that this is a stereotype, and of course, that is arguably the fact that it is a stereotype, and that is the image given to Conservatives, especially due to like wealth and stuff, and wealth and prestige. Then I think that that's a real danger, and especially due to the fact that Conservatives get a lot of money, as is recently, Boris Johnson has decided not to publish findings that there might be links to Conservative donors and the Kremlin, and that the fact that he has been unwilling to publish that it's something to be maybe a bit concerned about. So I think the Conservatives would be the one the Women's Equality Party feels are like the most terrifying to imagine with a majority.
Okay, so far of our 6 panellists, 2 of them fear the Conservatives winning, and 1 fears Brexit if they cut through, or the Brexit Party if they cut through. Our next speaker, please, if Mr. Richardson, we can hear your point of view on this.
I would fear the Labour Party the most because of their policies on private schools. They would like to close institutions like this and sell them off, and I'm fearful that I would be out of a job and I may have to work at a state school.
Terrible. Great those state schools are. Let me just point that out as the chair of this debate. Thank you for such a clear answer. I might just at this point remind the audience that the stated views of the panellists are not always necessarily the full story of the views that they hold. Thank you for such a direct answer. If I could call next, please, on Joe.
I'm going to have to agree with Dr. Richardson here, but not from the same point of view. I'd like to think that Labour's policies on spending and will just completely destroy Britain's economy. I feel like it could also get to a point like 1974 under Harold Wilson, when he introduced an effective rate of 98% of unearned income for incomes over 100,000 onto the population of Britain. And that just means the super rich will leave, and the people who've worked so hard to earn that amount of money will just be taxed heavily and not be as equal as they are. And again, the Labour Party want to spend so much money that Britain doesn't have. They'll take out loans and create a massive amount of government debt, which they'll want to take from the rich, which just won't work because the super rich will leave, as I've said, and the whole thing with the other rich is just not right. It's not fair on the community.
But is it not the case that your own party seems to be in an arms race with the Labour Party in terms of who has got the most magic money tree at the moment?
Yes, but Labour seem to spend more than us. If you look at their policies, their policies state that they're going to spend more money. And I just want to make a point about something that's happened today. Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, is more sensible than the extremist views of Corbyn, John McDonnell and Momentum, the corporation that's running Labour, has stepped down and thinks that you should not vote for Corbyn because he's not fit to run Parliament. So does that not make a statement that Labour aren't fit if one of their own party members, who's been in the Labour Party for years, thinks that they're not fit to get into Parliament?
Can I just say something on the magic money tree question? Because I like talking about magic money trees.
Yeah.
Conservatives actually really face on that a strategic issue. When we're in the austerity under Cameron and Osborne, the Conservatives could say, right, we're the party of fiscal responsibility. We know how to tax and spend government money. We will do it responsibly. When the Conservatives say, right, we'll spend extra millions and billions on health and education, Labour will always in an arms race, as you mentioned earlier, offer a higher incentive. So the risk the Conservatives have, I think you were alluding to, if they offer too much on education and health, for example, they risk losing their brand of being fiscally responsible, because they know that whatever policy they'll put, Labour will trump it, and then the voters will think, well, hang on, both the parties are sort of offering too much. By the Conservatives attacking Labour for spending plans, Conservatives are sort of undermining their own argument to an extent.
Thank you. I know that the Greens want to come in, but with one speaker who's not had a chance to speak so far, and wonderfully nobody seems to fear the Socialist Labour Party, so you're safe. What do you think?
People are going too hard on the Tories at the moment, this is where I have to sort of disclose that my personal views are not the same as the views of the party, because the party would say that it is in fact the Conservatives. However, I think that's too premature. Has anyone actually looked at Jo Swinson's voting record? Jo Swinson being leader of the Liberal Democrats. It is horrendous. She voted to cut disability benefits. She voted to cut wages for people off sick. She voted for bedroom window tax. She voted for a whole host of unequal measures and legislature. Far, far worse than the voting record of Mr Johnson, even worse than the voting record of dear old Mr Rees-Mogg. So, from a personal perspective, as well as the fact that the Lib Dems would reverse any procedures that have happened on Brexit so far, the Liberal Democrats are unbelievably dangerous, given the party is being run by basically a Tory in yellow, and an even worse Tory at that.
So I thought this would heat things up a little bit. I know that Thomas always asks me if he brings a point in. There's a point from the floor, and I'm going to take the point from the floor first, from Sorry.
Are there any parties that wouldn't completely screw us all up if they were elected?
Well, if I might just take that point and connect it with Mr. Shortman's point. Mr. Shortman said that his faith, I think, in the political system was in Britain the parties are broad churches. My concern, along with your concern, Soren, perhaps, is that those broad churches seem to be becoming narrow sects. They're not so broad anymore. Momentum's got hold of the Labour Party. According to our last speaker, the Liberal Democrats are becoming extreme in some ways. And one might argue the same is true of the Conservative Party. They've just, after all, expelled some of their members in a purge. So these are extraordinary times, and perhaps you're right to fear any of them winning an outright majority. But on the other hand, we've got a parliament which can't function, so we're in a right old pickle. Thank you for that point. Are there any other points from the floor before we take any more questions? These are points on the things that we're discussing at the moment, are they? Or further questions? Matt?
In response to the last question, do you think a more authoritarian approach would get Brexit done?
Well, I'm not going to put that to the panellists yet, because that's almost a different question. But if time allows, we'll come back and address that question, but it's certainly a good one. There were a couple of points that panellists wish to make. I'm going to take Tom and then Joe.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say I agree with Luke about the Lib Dems. I mean, at the moment, they are just yellow Conservatives. I mean, it is outrageous. But I think what Joe...
just to interrupt you for a moment, you are aware that your party's in an electoral pact with the Lib Dems, aren't you?
Yeah,
but not all agree. So we're hearing a green voice of
reason.
But that wasn't the main point I was to bring up. I was just pointing out I would more argue with Joe bringing up the person who quit the Labour Party. He said he's been with them for a while, but I'm fairly certain he joined during the New Labour movement, where essentially the Labour took the Conservative manifesto, photocopied it and put their own stamp on it. And I think that's obviously clearly why he disagrees with Jeremy Corbyn, because he's essentially isn't left wing. He's a centrist at heart.
Nicely put point, thank you. And
I'm just going to
Michelle?
respond to Tom Watson. He tweeted a day ago that he's been in the Labour Party for around 35 years, Tom. So that's kind of different to the 2010. And Luke, as Luke said, the Tories may be Conservatives in yellow, but from a Conservative point of view, the Lib Dems have gone from one extreme, to try and get themselves back on the political map. Because as you know, they were quite prominent. We were in a coalition with them, and then they kind of dropped off, per se. And they only have 21 seats in Parliament at the moment. And Joe Swinson is taking one extreme to get the Remainers on their side to try and get more seats in Parliament, which I just think isn't really right.
Can I just say a couple of quick points? So Tom Watson was part of the Curry plotters to try and get rid of Tony Blair for being too centre-right. And then from a campaign strategy from the Lib Dems point of view, having criticised the Vote Leave campaign for £350 million a week to save the NHS, they're now promising a Remain dividend of, I think, 50 billion just for stopping Brexit. So the Lib Dems have gone from criticising people from plucking numbers out of the air to themselves plucking numbers out of the air, I guess.
George?
First of all, I would like to say that, as Socialist Labour Party says, that what I'm saying is not necessarily my own personal views, it is the views of my party, especially, somehow also the ways I am saying them, and perhaps my bluntness earlier. But additionally, I'd also like to sort of add to the whole broad churches becoming more like narrow sets, and the idea of like shifting extremes and decisions just for the purpose of voters. A lot of the major parties actually do seem to. It does sometimes become a little bit more unclear where exactly they are on like the scale of extremes and more like balance and neutrality. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to our next question from the floor. It'd be nice to go in a different direction too from the existing topics. Thank you.
It's a bit similar to the existing ones. Is that okay?
Give us your question, or I might just hold it on for later.
It's slightly bounding off the first two questions, but I think one of the things that's been a bit overlooked is the amount of divisions that are actually in the country at the moment. So we've seen through things like Brexit, there has been a generational division. There's been racial divisions. For example, the amount of racial attacks went up drastically when Brexit was first announced. And there's also been even more geographical divisions. So I just wonder, with these whole idea of British values and things, how are we actually going to reunite a country? Because no matter the outcome, people aren't going to be satisfied. So I wonder how are you going to deal with that dissatisfaction?
That's an excellent question, but it's on slightly different ground. So let's take that question. How is your party, or for the two people not representing a party, what would your recipe be for mending the nation regardless of what you think of Brexit? Thank you. Okay, so this time, if we could start with Luke, please.
Well, the current division of the country is a minefield. I'd like to put that out there, first of all, and I don't think there will be a fix. There is not going to be one universal fix to repair the divisions apart from time, and even then time is not very forgiving. So in terms of how we would unify the country, I think a lot of the guff that's sort of been bandied about the whole Brexit problem is coming from Remainers who are unable to accept a democratic mandate. And so once Brexit is finished, and I'm sure Joe is going to go along the same lines, once Brexit is finished, once it's a done deal, once we cannot go back, we will finally be able to look past the divisions and say, we've got a new Britain now, let's rebuild Britain back to our best state before the EU became a factor. And I think the only way to do that is a complete and utter U-turn on the politics we have at the moment. At the moment, we're quite centre-right. And I think, just personally and from a party perspective, that a total change of political outlook would help to unify the country and give more hope, per se.
Thank you. Tom, what would the Greens do to bring national unity?
Well, I think it's important to recognise the divides we do have within the country before we act upon them. Like, for example, of course, the Women's Equality Party is going to bring up the gender pay gap, which is 9%. But I think just as, if not more important and pressing, are the two other major pay gaps we have. Firstly, the sexuality pay gap. Gay men are more than likely to be paid 10% less than their heterosexual straight counterparts, which I think is a major issue. Additionally, there is a racial pay gap even, as South Asian, that is people from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, that region, or South Asian origin I should say, are likely to be paid 20% less than their white colleagues, which is, I would argue, a much more pressing issue than the gender pay gap. And I think the Green Party would be more willing to commit to total equality for all, instead of, unlike other parties, which would be more focused on the single gender equality issue.
Thank you. And Joe?
As Luke said, I'm going to have to agree. The fact that there are people campaigning to Remainers going out protesting about the whole Brexit malarkey, if the Lib Dems, the Labour, the Women's Equality Parties who said you're going to have another election, and the Greens, if they all try and reverse Brexit, including another referendum, no matter the outcome, it's a direct violation of our democratic rights as humans to go against something that we as a nation voted for. You cannot go against that, and that will always cause a problem. So if it's reversed, you'll have Brexiteers going out on the streets, and if Brexit happens, you'll have Remainers going out on the streets. There's no solution. We just have to get it done, because otherwise you're going against the democratic rights of the people, which is fundamentally wrong.
Thank you. And if I could go next for Georgie.
Well, first of all, I'd like to just reply to what Joe said, particularly about the fact that a second referendum could perhaps be violating democratic rights. I think at this stage, given the amount of political turmoil and the fact that so the misinformation of Believe campaign that was of course the scandal. Boris Johnson was meant to go to a private hearing originally. Then the fact is that perhaps it wouldn't be necessarily violating it, because it's become so complicated that really to know what the country still wants. I mean, it's not violating democratic rights to just see if it's changed based on new information, based on seeing what actually voting for Brexit has done to the country, due to the fact that it hasn't been done yet. And in regards to divisions, other than the gender pay gap not necessarily being a priority, as Tom said, I do agree that there are loads of other issues with pay gaps, but just inequality in general, so other groups. And the Women's Equality Party does not just represent women, it is also aiming for equality in LGBTQ+, and other vulnerable groups, ethnic minorities. And is campaigning for not just to end the gender pay gap, but to end sort of sexual harassment, domestic abuse, equal representation everywhere. If there is much more equality between everyone of any group, regardless of identity, if everyone feel it's equal, just as society, then I feel divisions would be there would be fewer divides.
Thank you. If I want to come to the two teachers, please.
Yeah, of course.
So we've got Mr. Richardson and Mr. Shortman. What would be your panacea? What would you do? What do you think the nation needs to be put back together again after Humpty Dumpty's fall?
Personally, I don't think that the whole Brexit process made the country unhappy. It just highlighted or gave an opportunity for those people who were unhappy to rally around a particular cause. If you've been an unemployed blue-collar worker for 40 years, from the mines or the shipyards or the steelworks or whatever, you didn't suddenly become unhappy 3 years ago. So these are, and it's the same in the States, in the Rust Belt, you've got decades of unemployment or the lack of ability to reskill or move, and you're desperately unhappy, and those people haven't been listened to. And I think there's a crisis here. Why, no major party wanted to leave and yet we put it to the vote and more than half the country do. How does that work? Like, that's broken, right?
That's the scale of the difficulty we face.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, like, so fix that and then fix the country.
Thank you. Mr. Shorten.
Well, that's quite a challenge I've got to fix now, isn't it, in the models laid out there. I'll do my best in 2 minutes. Regional inequality, that was mentioned earlier on. I think home ownership is actually the key issue. If you're under 45, you're far less likely to be a homeowner, and therefore you're more likely to vote Labour across all races, sexual orientation, etc. And if you're over 45, you're more likely to be a homeowner. So actually, real wages have declined in the last 10 years since the financial crisis. And you can sort of tie that into the expenses scandal as well. People have lost confidence in the economic system and they've lost confidence in the political system. But I would have to agree with Dr. Richardson that if you can make people more mobile in the labour market so they can more easily move to different regions and different professions, and you raise living standards, that would be a way to heal divides, regardless of whether we're in favour of Brexit or not, whether Brexit is implemented. If all of us have an improvement in our living standards, we'll be a happier nation, I would argue.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to let you advance at this point simply because we're quite tight for time now. We've got we're to our final 12 minutes of the question time, and I'd like to pack in as many final questions as we can in that time. So I'm just going to take, what we'll do with this last bit is that we're just going to take a flurry of questions from the floor. Panellists, you don't have to answer them all. If you could just answer the ones that you think you're most interested in answering. So, Cameron, please.
What's the party's views on Donald Trump and America and relations with the United States?
Lovely. So, yeah, what does each candidate think of, or each panellist think of Trump and the relationship between Britain and the United States? Thank you. A second question. Sorry.
Is there any way that we could legally have a second referendum on Brexit? Because from what I've heard so far, according to our democratic rights, we have a right to decide, but we don't seem to have a right to change our minds. And that doesn't seem right, considering that we have no way of knowing what political carnage is going to happen until we've decided, and then we just can't go back. Is there any way that this could legally go down so that we could maybe decide that we don't want to be perpetually stuck trying to leave the EU and maybe dedicate our time to important stuff like pay gaps and global warming?
Thank you for such a perceptive and thoughtful question. Thank you, nice and clearly put. Bella.
I have two, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The first one, I think part of the frustration of the British public right now is that things aren't being done because Brexit is chugging its way through, and it has been for 4 years now. Not 4 years, 2 years, sorry.
Feels like 4.
Yeah. I think with issues like county lines going on, there's a number, but that's just to name one. That's something that I'm worried about, and it's not getting represented because we're still worrying about Brexit, and we're still arguing about the second referendum. My question would be, how are you going to deal with those issues while Brexit is still going on, because it looks like it's going to be there for a while. And my second question is more towards the Women's Equality Party and the Green Party. I love your mission statement, so this isn't a statement about you guys. But it's more, I think the worry is if either of you were to gain the majority and then control the government, I would say that a lot of people feel as though you're very single-minded and not able to run a country because your mission statements are very this is what we want to achieve. So how are you going to show that you can do that, if that makes sense?
Just on one point of fact, I'm not sure that the Women's Equality Party are actually fielding a sufficient number of candidates to actually get a majority. I think it would be impossible for them to do it. But for the Greens, that would certainly be applicable. Thank you very much. Pete.
I suppose it's more of a viewpoint question, really, but what do you think, as a party or individually, about the idea that the EU might be heading slightly more towards sort of sapped of individuality and sort of turn into a more federal set of states rather than individual countries in a union?
Thank you. And Casper.
So this is more of a domestic thing. Obviously, at the moment, the employment rate of the UK is at an all-time low. I'm obviously aware of such things as zero-hour contracts and stuff, but how do the parties believe Brexit is going to affect the employment, and obviously there's quite a bit of structural unemployment going on in parts like Scotland. So a lot of the parties believe Brexit will affect these stats, because I believe it's going to be quite difficult for them to go down to that problem.
Okay, so there is one more question. Sean.
Other than Brexit, what is really at the forefront of your policies? So things like schools, disabilities, and other things, because ultimately, if a party does get a majority or does get a number of seats, and we look past the point of Brexit, what is going to happen from that point onwards? What will you prioritise?
Lovely. So at the final part of question time now, we're going to come down the line from Mr. Richardson to Joe, and each panellist will reflect on some of the aspects of those questions. So I'll just repeat those questions again for the panellists on the floor. So how do you feel about Trump and the relationship between Britain and America? Can a second referendum be legal, and is it a good idea? Isn't Brexit getting in the way of a whole load of other things that need to be done? And is there a danger in a party like the Greens, a single issue party for want of a better word, getting a majority in Parliament? Is the EU drifting towards being a federal state? And what would be the impact of Brexit on our current good employment in the UK? And what is at the forefront of your policies beyond Brexit? Mr. Richardson, what would you like to say about any of those issues?
I think the Trump question is very interesting, because I think it's almost exactly the same as the issue that I was just talking about. There's lots of unhappy people, and you just need somebody to rally around, and that's the unhappy people in the States who've rallied around him. So, I mean, there's huge parallels there, and the same issue as in, is the actual political system and how people vote for people, does it work? Probably not. On the question of a second referendum, like, I think probably speak for 90-something% of the people, like, having a second referendum just makes it go on and on and on and on and on. So nobody cares that much now, we just want it done one way or the other, full stop, because that's what's killing the business, as Mr. Shortman was saying. These minority parties, I think realistically, the only thing they're ever going to do is be an influence on a major party. So, for example, like the DUP recently, you might find yourself in a position where you're 10 seats short and you need somebody to go with you on something, like the Conservatives with the DUP. So one of these minor parties might be able to get in bed with someone, and then they get some traction that way. I think that's realistic. They're never going to actually get into power. And what was your question again?
The EU's turning into a sort of federal.
Yeah, I mean, I think having spent a lot of time living in the EU, like, it's just not a happy place anyway. So yeah, we have this whole issue of whether we're leaving or not. Like, one of the major issues is that the EU has got a bag full of its own issues, and so I think if it tries to pull together closer, I think a lot of people are just going to be looking at Britain and thinking maybe we should go too, like in the Netherlands or wherever. So I think that's all I can remember.
Thank you. Luke.
Trump. Once he stops leaving the Paris Climate Accords, once he decides that he's actually going to do something for the good of humanity for once, then we might be able to enter some sort of deal with him, but otherwise we're not interested. We will wait for someone else to take up the reins, whether that be in less than a year or in about 3 or 4 years' time. Second referendum, is it legal? Yes. Is it a good idea? No. Purely on the basis that if we did it with everything we ever voted on, if we had a general election and the Conservatives won, Labour wouldn't then go and say, oh, sorry, we're in the minority and we didn't like that result, can we do it again? You can't do that. And the same principles apply to the EU referendum. Do you have the option to change your mind? This is a very important point, and I think it needs to be considered very carefully. Not many people have actually changed their mind. It's just more people have decided this is an important issue. The vote turnout at the first referendum the vote turnout amongst 18 to 25-year-olds was 25%. So if they were really bothered about the issue, they would have voted, but they didn't. And now they're suddenly piping up saying it's not what they wanted. Sorry, you should have voted first time around, and maybe the result would have gone another direction. And so therefore, there's no actual evidence to suggest that people have actually changed their minds. Certainly I haven't, and I think a lot of other people haven't either. So if you have a second referendum and it still says leave, what are you going to do then? We have to be prepared for that. it just, at the moment, people think it's unlikely, but we have to be prepared for it. So the second referendum is even more in the dark than perhaps the effects of an actual Brexit being done properly and cleanly.
I'm going to have to cut you short just in the interest of time.
Yeah,
it's a
of course.
very good answer.
I'll answer the other questions later.
Yeah, you don't need to answer all of the issues from the floor, just the ones that you feel the most passionate about. Tom.
Firstly, the Donald Trump, I think, as my comrade on the left, both physically and politically, said, him pulling out of the Paris Accords, him being a climate change denier, it just doesn't gel with the Greens' ideology at all. The second referendum issue, I believe that if there was a majority in favour of a second referendum, then it would be worth considering, but since it isn't, it isn't. Someone brought up about a single-issue party, but I think the Greens are often seen as a single-issue party, but I think it's more apt to look at them as a left-wing party with focus on the environment. So many of our policies outside of the environment you would see fall into line with Labour or even possibly the Socialist Labour Party, depending on yeah.
That's great. That's answered three of them. Brilliant. Thank you. George.
I'll make this brief. So the Women's Equality Party actually agree with the Greens and Socialist Labour Party regarding Trump that though for slightly different reasons, those that previously stated are also incredibly valid, but given his sort of alleged sort of behaviour, especially regarding in the areas of sexual harassment, then Women's Equality Party feel that until Trump is either impeached or is replaced in the next American presidential election, then it would be better to maybe not have as many trade relations with the US, as it only encourages that sort of behaviour in leaders when, quite frankly, he is not fit, in the Women's Equality Party opinion, to be the leader of such a massively influential nation. Regarding being a single issue party, and also regarding what else we stand for other than maybe not necessarily Brexit but equality, though equality is of course and of course we are seen as a single issue party, that is, equality is still of course a main thing factor, is particularly caregiving, parenting, especially for single parents or parents who are very low on money, don't have resources, and education. So trying to improve the education system to be more equal, so there isn't this massive divide between certain private schools, certain state schools, and so there is a much more sort of even standard in education and the ability for parents to raise their children.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shortman, of those questions, which do you think is the most striking for you to answer?
Well, I find them all striking, but I'll be as concise as possible. So Donald Trump, that proves that anyone can be president of the United States, anyone can be a political leader. So we'll all see each other in 20 years' time in Davos. Legally, a second referendum, I don't think any party can make that work, whether they want it or not. Either Lib Dems would revoke it, Labour would promote their own deal, it would take too long to be in effect. Frustration of Brexit, domestic and foreign policy sort of being eyes off the ball on that. County lines in particular issue for all schools and education establishments really of young people being exploited, so that needs to be looked into. I have to agree with Dr. Richardson on single issue parties. Greens, for example, and Brexit Party perhaps as well, they're likely to do well in European elections but struggle in general election when we elect a government. The employment rate that Casper mentioned, I think the main issue facing developed economies is technology replacing labour. I'm still waiting for the day when a robot will come to my classroom and tell me that, Mr. Shortman, I'm replacing you, so that's my fear. EU heading towards a federal crisis. That was one of my reasons for voting for Brexit, actually. I felt that arguments on sovereignty, etc., I felt that the EU will break apart at one point. Sweden, Holland, Poland, Netherlands, Denmark, to name some countries that are Eurosceptic. So I do think eventually the EU will collapse, but that's only my view. Other than Brexit, what's the forefront of my policy? I suppose what I would like to see at Gresham's is the introduction of A-level politics, given that we've got quite a captive audience, but that decision's not on my head.
I'll second that. Thank you. And Joe?
I'm going to answer every question, but very quickly and very briefly. Donald Trump, I'll have to agree with basically everyone. I feel like there could be something there, but to do with his ideologies and Paris Accords and all that, it needs to be well thought out and well decided. Second referendum, yes, it's legally possible. Is it a good idea? Again, no, because it's, Peter, I would have to agree about the EU and it collapsing. I feel like us getting out now is beneficial for us in the long term, maybe not in the short term, but definitely in the long term. County lines, I'm going to have to address. We, as the Conservatives, plan, I'm going to go into stats, I like stats, 20,000 more police on the streets, 6,000 more police to be recruited in the year, and 10,000 extra prison places to sort out knife crime, sort out county lines, sort out all that stuff. Single policy parties, I feel like the Greens neglect schools, NHS, really, they just focus on the environment. And I'm going to go, I feel like your question has been a bit neglected on party policies and like the other things apart from Brexit. And I feel like as the Conservatives, NHS, we plan £33.9 billion boost in funding, £14 billion boost in schools, and £1 billion increase in police spending. And I just feel like we as a party are not ashamed to shy away our policies as nobody else has really mentioned any of them.
Thank you very much. I can't give you a right of reply, unfortunately. 2 years ago, the first question that was asked was, should Theresa May quit when she had got Brexit done? And that didn't quite work out as planned. Another big difference from 2 years ago, and what a fantastic difference it's been, although we've still got a couple of staff members on here, this is now primarily a student panel. It takes huge courage to stand for election in a school election, and even more courage to do this. And I'm blown away with what you four have managed to do this evening. Incredibly impressive performance. And thank you so much to my colleagues for so many words of wisdom and wonderful things to think about too. And last of all, it's great. 2 years ago was fantastic, but there were very, very few people in the audience. This is much more like it. Brilliant.
There were 5 people 2 years ago.
Yeah, at the start of the evening there were 5 people, so this is really good to see. Thank you for your support, some brilliant questions, and can I implore all of you in the audience to remember that you all do have a vote that counts, at least in the school election. You will be voting, more details on that to follow. Massive thank you to Mr Myers for filming and recording this evening, and if I could just ask all of our panellists to stay behind, but before you go, can you give them a massive round of applause? Gives me great heart that the one thing that united us all was our dislike of Donald Trump. And on that, good night and thank you.